and it's also a book for you. If any of my struggles can inspire you, it would make everything even more worthwhile. It all began when I was struck down by a terrible event that ended my life as I knew it, all in the space of 24 hours. When sitting in the hospital, an invisible blade was cutting deep into my soul. But I managed to get up and push through, healing my inner world, my mind, body and soul, as I realized how important it was to do this first. I made many courageous steps forward to follow my heart and fulfill my passion and purpose in life. It wasn't easy, of course, but now I'm through. I want to show others, like you, how I did this to inspire them to be able to do the same. I am passionate about reaching out to people, and with my brand Purely Inspired, I know that I have something that people want and need. I exist now to provide a service to others. I so want to connect and communicate the love and inspiration that I feel. I wrote this book in the hope that it might give people the faith to believe that things will get better. If you're suffering right this minute, please know it will get better. In a judgmental world, it's so important to try not to judge. I know from experience how important it is to meet people where they are at with kindness, love, and compassion. We can't control the things that happen to us or others. We must accept that life will run its course, but the main thing is we can learn from our experiences. I had to learn how to empower myself with a lot of courage and willpower on my own, with the many earth angels who came to support me. I always strive to see the positive side of life, and even when a negative situation presents itself, I have learned to see what life lesson this was trying to teach me or make me understand during this time. The pain and challenges have made me dig even deeper than I believed I could, and I will always strive to move forward through these experiences. You'll be surprised just how deep you can dig. I try to keep a simple, humble, and positive approach to life despite all its obstacles. We all are just trying our best. I want to love, to be kind and compassionate, and I feel a strong purpose by helping others see that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And in fact, the light is even more beautiful than ever. Golden nuggets. We all know that things happen for a reason. There is a way forward, and after the storm, the sun will shine again. Part 1. Love and Loss. Chapter 1. Meeting my soulmate Tony. Every great love starts with a great story. Quote by Nicholas Sparks. Tony and I were once those young lovers, doing spontaneous and silly things together many years ago. We always enjoyed each other's company and would often chill out with the music pumping in the background to his favourite reggae, country or easy listening music. If we had family or friends around, Tony would be the one telling me to hurry up so that things would be ready for gatherings or for the meals we would often prepare at home. He would be quietly ensuring everyone was made comfortable in the background, enough food was on the table, and that everyone was taken care of with a beverage or a cold beer. Yes, Tony loved a beer or a drink with friends or family. He had such an infectious laugh and was always a happy drunk if he'd had a few. He would often play silly pranks on others and was a big kid at heart, even as he got older. Tony was a social and fun guy who loved people like me. We just enjoyed seeing people happy. When Tony and I met all those years ago, I was the tender age of 19 and he was only 20. I had gone to Fiji the year prior for my dad's family reunion he had planned for us all, but my dad never made this trip as he had passed away suddenly. My immediate family and I had travelled to the island where Tony lived during this trip, but I actually never saw Tony at this time. For some reason, I had fallen in love with Fiji, which was my first time there. I couldn't understand the pull I felt, but I longed to go back there again. A year later, I planned a trip with my best friend Jasmine, whom I worked with in the disability service. We were two young girls who worked hard and had saved up for a trip to Australia, Fiji and Hawaii. This would be a holiday we would remember many years later. Our planned trip to Australia was to spend time with her family who lived in Queensland first. Who would think that years later I would eventually move here? The trip to Fiji would be a bit different as we were planning on doing many things on our own and explore the sights around Fiji. We were so excited. I had told Jasmine about my family reunion there a year earlier and how I was longing to go back but couldn't understand why. I fell in love with the friendly people with warm smiles, the culture, beautiful weather, and not to mention wanted to know more about my family history. Our planned holiday came around very fast and we made sure we picked the right season to be away, around late October, early November. We had a wonderful holiday in Queensland with Jasmine's family, who were so welcoming, and we enjoyed many memorable moments with them. But after a few weeks, it was time for Jasmine and I to say our goodbyes to her family in Australia and head off to the Fiji Islands. This was only to be a short stop off for around 8 days, as our next destination was Hawaii. The day arrived for Jasmine and I to land in Fiji. On arrival, we had decided that we would stay at a hotel close to Nadi and then travel down to the island. There was a family connection. We had arranged to stay in the bure. For those who don't know, bure is the Fijian word for a wood and straw hut, sometimes similar to a cabin. So we were to stay there with Tony's grandmother. I had not met Tony at all by this stage, so I was unsure what was going to unfold. I recall those memories of arriving in Fiji. You could feel the humid, tropical heat as you stepped off the flight. The sun was beaming so bright, clear blue skies, tropical heat flowing through the air, and the sense of such excitement as here were two carefree young ladies just exploring the world together. As we walked through the airport after clearing border requirements, you could see the many taxi drivers and shuttle drivers ready to transport the arriving guests to the various resorts or hotels around Nadi or close by. There were also many locals there to meet with their loved ones returning from their trips overseas. There were such beautiful smells lingering in the air of the tropical frangipanis and other flowers that were made into leis, which are Polynesian garland of flowers. Many were being presented to the guests of the exclusive resorts in the area. The sound of Fijian music being sung by the singers strumming on their guitars as guests arrived. But what stood out for us both were the people and culture. We both noticed here were such humble people with the most beautiful smiles. They were all so friendly. But, like many places, there were always a few not so nice people targeting the tourists, but overall, there were so many who made our trip one to remember. Jasmine and I stayed at the lovely resort across the road from the airport in Nadi. It was great, and we just grinned as we knew we were going to have a great time enjoying the sights and exploring Fiji. There was a lush tropical garden that surrounded the resort's main pool area with a swim-up bar and restaurant. A local singer would play in centre stage and serenade the guests with his Fijian music and melodious voice. On our first night, we enjoyed the Fijian cuisine in the restaurant and made use of the cocktails by the poolside. We laughed about this part of the trip many years later, as we both spoke about getting tattoos of geckos when we were there. We never did. Guess it was just one of those moments you have when you have a few too many cocktails or drinks. Why geckos, you may ask? Well, for us, we've never seen any this size in New Zealand, and there were many decent sized ones that would crawl up the walls, even inside. Jasmine often spoke of the large toad she saw and was also amazed by the size of these too. We stayed in Nadi for a few days before our plane trip to the island. There was a friendly Fijian lady by the name of Lani who I will always remember. She became a very close friend of mine, but we lost contact many years later. Lani had the most beautiful smile with her pearly white teeth, bubbly personality, and she was perfect for the resort's tour desk, as she was able to build such a great rapport with the many guests who would come to stay. She had a wealth of knowledge of the area and things to do around Fiji. Jasmine and I would stop by her desk and catch up when we were there. We all got on very well, but we didn't realise that she would be so generous and invited us to her village nearby to meet her family and friends. This was an experience Jasmine and I appreciated so much, as we got to finally see what it was like living in a village in Fiji. One of the local taxi drivers took us all to the village after we agreed that we would be honoured to go with her one day. Lani had arranged everything, and we really didn't want to be too much trouble. Both Jasmine and I understood the Fijian custom and made sure we didn't go empty-handed. The local village was tucked away off the main road. The area surrounding it had plantations of food crops that they had planted to sustain many of the villages. The simple Fijian burrows were carefully built around the village, and the main chief's home was in the centre. As we arrived with Lani, word must have got around there were to be 2 foreign guests coming to visit. The many children in the village ran up to greet us, giggling and smiling as we pulled up in the taxi. They stared and watched as we spoke, and all I can remember are the many of them that just smiled and smiled. Everywhere we walked, and when we sat down to be greeted by the elders, they ran up to make sure they sat right next to us or between us. Our hair must have been fascinating to many of them. As we sat down in Lani's home, there were a few of the younger girls who would stroke our long hair, as it was not a frizzy afro style they were used to. These children were so grateful to have us there, and the simple things we would often take for granted, like a simple can of fizzy drink, was gold to them. We watched as these children enjoyed having fun with some of the simplest toys they would make, or just running around playing with a ball. Their smiles were just so beautiful, and they were happy. This was such a humble experience where you got to see people who didn't have all the riches of the world, but were just so happy and content with what they had. As 2 young ladies exploring the world, we understood and appreciated what this meant to them having us visit, and for us, it was something we treasured for many years later. I had seen this before when I travelled with my family to Fiji for my father's family reunion. Mum had taken us to the village where her father's family were from in Levuka, and also when she took us to the main island she grew up in, Mokongai. Mokongai is an island belonging to Fiji's Lomonoviti archipelago. We enjoyed such a lovely hearty meal put on by Lani's family that day. The taste from the authentic Fijian curry and roti, fresh raw fish marinated in coconut cream, palusami, and the food that had been cooked in the lovo were delicious. A lovo, as described in Google, is: the term lovo also refers to the underground oven that is used to cook the feast. The lovo is often reserved for special occasions in Fijian villages and is a core part of the local culinary arts. This traditional technique involves digging a pit into the ground and placing hot coals inside. The day we travelled to the island seemed to go by fast. Jasmine and I had our own hire car and drove down to the wharf where we were to catch a boat to take us out to the island. For some reason our plans were delayed and we ended up taking longer than expected, arriving a bit later than scheduled. It was getting dark and much cooler. The sun had set in the distance and an amazing Fijian sunset could be seen as we arrived at the wharf. It was spectacular. I recall this evening so well as we got closer to the shore. Tony was busy partying in the house where his parents were with some of the locals and guests who were staying at the family cottages. Boy, did we feel like we had just crashed the party vibe getting in late and trying to drag off our heavy luggage from the boat. Thank goodness for the polite boatmen who were able to assist us. The music was loud and vibing from inside with reggae music. I could see Tony up and dancing his little strange jig, bouncing up and down to his favourite songs and laughing with that infectious laugh. Since then he was always a social bunny and life of the party. The boatman had gone inside to tell them we had arrived and needed to go down to the burrow where we would be staying. I could hear Tony rattling off in Fijian loudly and asking why we had arrived so late. I remember thinking, what a rude so-and-so, as we heard the conversation whilst we waited outside. Tony, despite his initial complaining, helped the boatman and a few others escort us down the dark track to the burrow in the mangroves. There was no electricity on the island as their main source of power was a generator and kerosene lanterns. We had a few of these and smaller torches to light the way as we arrived. It was cool but still very humid with the tropical air. I hadn't really seen Tony's face, only his silhouette, as I wanted to just hurry up and get to where we were staying. I recall being so annoyed with him and rolled my eyes when he spoke. I guess word must have got around the island that we were there, and over the next few days I started to notice Tony in the distance. I would catch a glimpse of him looking, but we didn't really connect or chat at that stage. The famous large mango tree outside his parents' house was known for many memorable moments where guests, family or friends would all congregate to enjoy fun times together. Tony would position his speaker in the tree branches so he could have his music blaring and create the ambience of a positive and fun environment. The very first time Tony and I got to meet was after Jasmine and I enjoyed a day relaxing in the tropical sun. We were walking from the beach, heading back to the Bure, but were called over by one of Tony's friends. He had asked where we were from, so we explained. We were from New Zealand. The conversation continued, but we went to freshen up after our swim. We arranged to meet up again that night under the mango tree. Well, the rest kind of speaks for itself. I recall walking up to the mango tree along the dark track with Jasmine. We only had a small torch, but the stars in the sky shone bright, so it was a beautiful night. Yes, the music was already on, and you could see Tony and some of the locals already drinking with a few guests who had stopped by that were staying in the cottages. Tony's father was also there enjoying the fun, as he liked to socialise and welcome everyone who came to the island. His mother was busy finishing off cooking and cleaning up inside. I could see Tony looking from the corner of my eye, but I didn't want to make eye contact. I could see his friend's sister sitting beside him, who was getting very friendly, placing her arm around his neck or trying to place her hand on his leg. He had explained to me later she was still wanting a relationship with him, but he wasn't interested. I just sat with Jasmine enjoying a cold beer and chatted with the other guests. But it didn't take long till Tony plucked up the courage to come and say hello to us. I was still annoyed with him and kept our conversation very brief. As the days followed, we were somehow bumping into Tony, and we knew there was something starting between us. We were getting on so well, and it was as if we had known each other for years as we spoke and laughed about many things. We shared and spoke about a lot of our experiences together. It was perfect. There was a special connection between us, and it was starting to be the beginning of a real-life romance that would continue long distance. A simple kiss now and then, but that was as exciting as it got. Tony was a complete gentleman, and he had a heart of gold. I was falling in love with this humble, strong, attractive and simple man that lived on an island in Fiji. What was happening to me? I sat years later laughing with Jasmine and Tony about this saga, as we all knew how the many family members around us were spreading such wonderful stories. There were rumours of Jasmine and I having big sessions, drinking up large with the guys and hooking up, as they would call it. The gossip lines of Radio Pacific were running hot, and it was very interesting listening to it all. Little did many of them know that even though we spent such a short time on the island where Tony lived, we had gone to Suva to see my mum's cousin, who was a nun there and lived in a convent. We spent some time with her and the other nuns in the convent for a few days and planned to stay at a Kontiki resort before leaving for our next destination, Hawaii. Jasmine and I travelled back to the opposite side of the island where we thought no one would find us, as we just wanted to enjoy some time with young folk from other foreign countries who were on holiday like us. Back in those days, there were no such things as mobile phones, and we were just cruising around on what they would call Fiji time. Jasmine and I managed to travel over by boat to the island again, checked in at Kontiki, and were relaxing after our big trip from Suva. We had no idea the locals in this small remote town recognised us and had sent word to Tony's father that the girls were back. He didn't know we were on the other side of the island until one of the local boatmen saw Tony after a dive trip he had finished. The boatman had told Tony we were staying at Kontiki, as he had dropped us off there with some other tourists. Jasmine and I had just settled into our bure and were relaxing as the temperature was very warm and humid. At that moment, one of the staff members from the resort came round and asked us to go over to the sandy front where they had social gatherings near the volleyball area. Jasmine and I weren't sure what was going on, so we went to see why they had asked us to go there. I could hear loud music pumping from a distance, coming closer and closer towards the shoreline from out at sea. It was coming from a large dive boat with speakers blaring reggae music, vibing to the sound of reggae artist Lucky Dube. I recognised the music straight away and could feel that fluttering feeling inside me. My heart knew it was Tony, and I smiled to myself, but Jasmine knew why. We looked at each other, amused at the grand entrance, and wondered how on earth people in such a remote part of Fiji knew where to find us. The dive boat pulled up close to the shoreline, and one of the guys from the resort went out to greet Tony as he tied up the boat and jumped off. He was the cool, handsome guy with his wavy dark brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and his cap, white t-shirt with dive team written in blue on the back, and shorts. He was barefoot and holding a bottle of Bounty Fiji rum in his hands as he walked across the white sandy beach towards us. Tony was always organising things, and I could hear him rattling things off to staff in the Fijian language. He walked up to us, greeted us with his cheeky smile and simply said, "Bula, welcome back." He chuckled as he placed the bottle of rum down on the table, and in no time the staff members rushed over with glasses and Coke. We sat together and enjoyed a few drinks and the music together. Tony explained how our plan to stay discreet and unnoticed didn't work, especially in a town like this where everyone knew his parents and him as well. Tony had come over as requested by his dad and asked if we wanted to stay in one of the vacant cottages on the hill. Taken aback by the kind gesture, we agreed and returned with Tony on the boat. That week I spent with Tony was very special, and a bond formed that I could only describe as magic. For some reason, this humble yet down-to-earth island guy with his huge heart of gold was doing something to me, and I had never felt this way before. We spent quite a bit of time together with Jasmine and the few other tourists who were there. We went out on the dive boat for diving expeditions with Tony, or just relaxed on the island enjoying the beautiful weather, basking in the hot sun, getting our golden tans on, or swimming in the pristine, clear, warm, tropical water. Tony and I became very close, but we were just friends who seemed to click. The only romance we shared was a simple kiss now and then, but we knew what we had was turning out to be something far more special than we could explain at the time. As the days went by on the island, Jasmine and I were settling into the slower pace of the island. Jasmine would say to me her fond memories were of Tony's grandmother cooking, as she always knew how to make something delicious from the bare essentials. She would make the most mouth-watering and divine home-cooked buns that were so soft, and traditional fried pancakes, often referred to as half-moons, for breakfast. Living on the island was very different, as there was no electricity, and even doing the laundry was back to the basics: hand washing, scrubbing on an old-fashioned scrubbing board, and drawing water from a well. In time, they did have an older-style wringer washing machine, but at the time, it was learn how to hand wash clothes. Years later, when Tony and I went back to the island with our first son, Tyson, I remember trying to do this with the local staff who worked for the family. They refer to them as the house girls. I wanted to wash all my own baby's clothes, being a new fussy mum, and a simple task turned out to take most of the morning and day learning the skill. It was actually not as easy as I thought it would be, and doing it in the tropical heat, well, that was another mission in itself. There was no popping your laundry into a washing machine, laundry powder, and pressing a switch or turning a dial. This was all manual, from drawing the fresh water out of the well, scrubbing, rinsing, and repeat, then squeeze and hang. But back to the first time. When we initially found out we missed our flight out of Fiji, Jasmine was annoyed as she wanted to get to Hawaii. I didn't mind, as I was getting on very well with Tony. We were amazed, though, as many people who had assumed Jasmine and I were up to mischief when we were on the island and in Fiji. We laughed many years later because all the assuming that went on was just not true. Tony was always a practical joker and did silly things even to me. We'd gone out on one of his dive trips, taking a few guests out on the dive boat. Jasmine and I were able to go along and enjoy the trip out to sea. I recall on this occasion, as the guests went down with the other diving instructor, we waited on the boat, soaking up the sun's rays. Tony had come along to where I sat to offer to put suntan lotion on my back. I was a bit confused, but agreed. Little did I know that he had put oil or grease on it, showing off as his mate was there laughing at him. I was not impressed and just looked at him thinking, grow up. In time, things like this didn't surprise me with Tony, and I would just shake my head at him and roll my eyes. We were having a great time, so it didn't really bother us at the time about our missed flight. Well, maybe Jasmine a bit. But we knew we had to finally organise our flights out of Fiji. We were on standby and were eventually given a departure date by Qantas a week after our scheduled flight. We had planned on meeting one of my older sisters in Hawaii as she lived there at the time. She was not impressed that we had not made the flight, and of course, this started a flurry of inquiries to find us. I tried to get a message through to my mum to pass on to her, but the lines were down at the time due to the weather. A few days later, I heard the Fijian housemaid, a staff member who worked for Tony's parents, calling loudly because there was a phone call from me. I went down to the main house. It was a call from Saudi Arabia. I couldn't figure out who it was, but then I heard her say it was an aunt related to my mum's sister-in-law in New Zealand. She worked for one of the members of the Saudi royal household, and I was later told that she had a private phone line around the world. The call was to see if we were okay, as my mum had been worried about us. I assured her that I was fine. When I later spoke to my mum, I heard the many stories that were being spread about us by some family members, a horrid web of gossips who had nothing better to do. Jasmine and I made the scheduled Qantas flight to Hawaii. We had been upgraded to first class and were thrilled. Tony travelled up with us in the local taxi with his friend Luke, as they were also going to the Lucky Dube concert, which was being held in Nandi. Luke was living in Fiji at the time with his family, as they had built a resort in town close to the beach. Both Tony and I felt such sadness as we knew we would finally have to say goodbye at the airport. We had fallen in love, but at the time didn't really understand what was happening as we lived in two different countries. How could a relationship even survive when we were so far apart? I was so reluctant to go through security and leave Tony behind. We had enjoyed a few beverages together, so Jasmine and I were feeling quite merry despite the circumstances. It was a way of trying to mask the sadness. Saying goodbye at the airport was very emotional, and we were both sad to leave Fiji. Jasmine and I boarded the first class cabin on the plane and were quite chuffed we were going to have this special service all the way to Hawaii. Looking at each other after we sat down, we smiled and thought, let's enjoy this. We both ordered our drinks. I made mine a double rum and coke. I sat there feeling the pull on my heartstrings and drank my rum. But I was so tired emotionally from our big week. Jasmine and I ended up falling asleep for the entire flight, and we only woke up as we were landing in Hawaii. We looked at each other. We'd missed out on everything. We rolled our eyes in disbelief but laughed as we knew we both needed the sleep. As we landed, we didn't realise we needed coins for the trolleys on arrival and only had our traveller's checks left on us. Here were two young, carefree ladies in the baggage claim area thinking, what are we going to do? It was our first trip together to Hawaii, although I had been a few years earlier, and we needed to go through border control. Feeling tired, worn out, and just wanting to go have a good shower, we both picked up our luggage and dragged it through border control to get to the other side. It was heavy, and we were struggling to pull it through the baggage hall. We looked at each other, shaking our heads in disbelief and laughing at how silly we must have seemed to the people watching us. We didn't care, as we just needed to get through, as we were so over travelling by this stage. As we walked through the arrivals area, I could see my sister standing there with her hands on her hips, not impressed with what she was seeing. I thought to myself, here we go, I guess the lecture will be next, as I already knew what was coming. We stayed in Hawaii for just 3 or 4 days before we flew back to New Zealand. This overseas trip was a highlight for Jasmine and I, and we often to this day reminisce about the memories we shared there with Tony. Back in New Zealand, I couldn't stop thinking of this island guy who had touched my heart in a way I couldn't explain to anyone. The warmth of his soul and his heart of gold was such an attraction for me, and we had connected on such a whole different level. He was humble, polite, shy, compassionate, cheeky, and such a fun person to be around. So tidy, meticulous, and fussy too. And he loved kids and animals as well. His passions were diving and being out at sea fishing, or just being out on the open water, taking in the salty air and fresh cool breeze, or floating in the boat, catching a bit of sunshine. I just wanted to be around him, and we knew this was the start of something more. It wasn't just a physical attraction between two people, but much more than that. He was fit and strong living on the island, and I knew he'd be able to survive even in the most difficult situations, as he knew how to make do with what essentials he had. At the time, I was feeling great too, as I was dancing in a Cook Island dance group with my younger sister, which kept me fit, and I also worked hard in my community service role, which was very physically demanding as well. I sat with my mother one day and asked her what it felt like to be in love. I will always remember her telling me, "If you can't live without them, that's love." From that moment, I knew the bond I had with Tony was special, but we didn't realise this love affair would be forbidden or that we'd be shunned by the culture and family around us. Tony and I would write love letters to one another whenever we could, as we didn't have emails, computers, or those forms of technology, which would have been so much faster. The only quiet and private access Tony had to a phone was an old-fashioned dial phone on the island, which he could use when he was working in the dive shop. He was a manager there, so he had access to the phone and would call me when no one was around to listen to his calls. I would patiently wait every time I knew a letter from Tony was due and run excitedly to the mailbox when the postman arrived on his bicycle with the mail. In the end, the postman would notice me rushing out and just hand the mail directly to me instead of putting it in the box. It was as if they knew and just laughed, as I must have looked like a love-struck teenager. Many years later, Tony and I would sit and try to tell our boys about our love story and writing letters to each other, but they would tell us that we were in the dinosaur age, as for them, this was so long ago and foreign to the technology they are used to now. Our long-distance relationship continued for a few months, and we knew that we needed to find a way to meet up again soon. We were both feeling the effects of our heartstrings pulling. Tony continued working in the dive shop, managing the operations around the island and looking after tourists. He was known for his skills and enjoyed taking people out on night dives, exploring the underwater world, especially the sharks that lurked in the ocean. He was seen as a risk-taker to many there, and would often get told he was crazy doing this. Tony knew what he was doing and would never put anyone at risk. He just had a great love for the ocean and the creatures and marine life that lived underneath the surface. Tony also assisted his parents with the general upkeep and running of their small family business, which catered for tourists who needed accommodation on the island. He would also be one of the main ones looking after the social activities and ensuring the tourists enjoyed their holiday and island experience. When Tony planned his first trip to New Zealand, he told no one about it. He had made up his mind that he was coming to see me, then going to Sydney, Australia, to visit his older sister, whom he hadn't seen for a number of years. He planned this trip carefully, telling his father he was going to Suva to do a diving course, but, in fact, he was going there to sort out his visa to travel to New Zealand and Australia. He continued to work very long hours every day as he was preparing for this trip. I knew of his plans and we both figured out how it would work. Eventually, he told his parents that he was travelling overseas as he had sorted his own passport and visas out. His father was shocked and wanted to know how he had managed to do all this. Tony was very independent, and when he had a goal in mind, he would achieve it, no matter what. The days drew closer and the nights seemed shorter as we got excited about Tony's first trip to New Zealand. I had a permanent smile on my face as I knew I'd finally be seeing him again, and the excitement I could feel in the pit of my belly was such an amazing feeling. It felt like nothing else mattered, and all I wanted was for the days to hurry up. He was feeling the same, but he was also very nervous about officially meeting my mother for the first time and my family. The day finally came. It was a perfect day for him to arrive. The sun was shining and the weather was fine and clear, the sky a beautiful blue with whispering clouds. I had spent the morning changing several times trying to find the right outfit to wear. I didn't want to be overdressed, but I wanted to make a nice effort and wear something that showed how wonderful I was feeling. I was nervous but so excited to see him, and once I was finally ready, I drove out to Auckland International Airport to wait for his flight to arrive. I stood there patiently, pacing around a little, watching the Solari board flick round and round as it showed the arrivals coming in. Finally, the Air Pacific flight arriving from Nadi, Fiji had landed. Oh my gosh, he's here was all I could think. It was all happening and I felt like a young teenager in love for the very first time. I felt butterflies and had a goofy grin on my face. I was smiling at anyone who passed by, greeting them with a big positive hello. I'm sure some of them must have wondered if I was on some happy pills or something. I watched as the passengers came through after clearing customs and quarantine. One by one, they all filed out with trolleys of suitcases and luggage, peering around for their loved ones, waiting to greet them or looking for drivers of the coaches if they were tourists. I waited, and I waited, and I waited, but no Tony. I was constantly checking my watch and it seemed like an eternity. My heart sank. What had happened? Where was he? Had he been held up inside or what? The questions rushed through my mind. I started to panic as I had only heard from him hours beforehand and knew he was getting on this flight. I waited some more and made what limited inquiries I could, but no one could give me any answers. I was deflated, disappointed, and very sad. I reluctantly walked to my car, paid for my parking, and went on my way. I drove home pondering, but also in tears, as I didn't know how to find him or what had happened. As I got home, I noticed there were no other vehicles in the driveway. Mum had gone out with my sisters and no one was home. That was great, as none of them could see how hurt I was. I went to the kitchen to pop on the jug and make a much-needed cup of coffee. I sat alone for a few hours thinking of possible scenarios. Around late afternoon, close to 4 p.m, the phone rang in the kitchen dining area. I was still by myself. The operator asked if I would accept the reverse charges. I knew at that point it was Tony, wherever he was. I told the operator it was fine and please connect the call as soon as possible. There was a delay and a pause, and I heard breathing from the other end. I asked a few times, "Tony, is this you?" I could hear background noise, music and laughter, and glasses being put down. The voice returned with a, "Yeah, it's me, I'm here." Of course you can imagine that by this stage I was starting to get a bit worried, but Tony, being Tony, was completely calm and giggled as he tried to explain where he was. I managed to figure out that he had somehow made his way to downtown Auckland to a backpackers bar on a bus with some tourists he met from the flight. I asked Tony to please just stay where he was so I could come and get him, as he was confused about where he was, this being his first time to New Zealand. I grabbed my car keys and handbag and rushed out the door. It took a bit of time to find out where exactly he was, but I eventually found the bar in Fort Street. The parking in the area was terrible, so I had to park a fair bit away. As I walked closer, I could feel that excited and warm feeling, knowing he was safe and was here. The bar was noisy but not overcrowded. It was a popular venue and I could hear Tony's laughter from outside. He was obviously having a great time with his new friends he had made on the flight. As I approached the door, I could see him wearing his favourite short-sleeved white hoodie with the words Dive Team written in blue on the back. He had his favourite shorts on and a cap with his hair in a ponytail and the boat shoes he liked to wear. He had his back to the door, so he didn't see me walk in and approach. I smiled as I saw him laughing away with the guys from the flight. As I walked towards him, he turned around and saw me. As excited as I was, he jumped off his bar stool and gave me the biggest, tightest hug, saying, "Finally, you're here." His tender lips gave me a warm kiss, and he introduced me to the others as his girlfriend. I was a bit taken aback and blushed, but smiled shyly. They all explained how Tony had taken the wrong turn out after clearing quarantine and just followed all the other foreign tourists to the side area where some other buses were. He had been there all the time but thought I hadn't arrived to pick him up. The guys laughed as they told me that Tony was disappointed thinking I wasn't going to be there and decided to open up his duty-free and start drinking as he waited and waited. He then decided to hop on the backpacker shuttle with them and ended up in town. We left the bar and drove home. Tony was chatting in the car and happy to finally be in New Zealand. We laughed and discussed his little introduction to the country, but I knew we hadn't finished the biggest test. Tony was chilled out and had such a feeling of joy and happiness, but I was very concerned. How could I sober him up enough to meet my mother? I cringed thinking of her reaction and to seeing him in this state. As we got closer to home, I slowed down and noticed they were all still out. I thought, great, this is perfect. I managed to get Tony out of the car, but he was by this stage drunk. Oh my God, I thought. Panic started to settle in. My mother and sisters were coming home and I could only imagine their reactions. Tony and I went upstairs and he went to the lounge area to sit on the couch. I went to make him a coffee, hoping I would be able to sober him up even slightly before Mum got home. I was so worried, as this was the first time I had taken a guy home to officially meet my mother. And what a great introduction this was going to be. Not. As I finished making our coffee, I heard the sound of a car pulling up in the driveway. We lived in a 2-story brick home and I could peer out the window to see who it was. Oh shit, it's them, I said to Tony. He had fallen asleep on the couch but woke up as I startled him. He thought I wanted to get romantic, but on the contrary, I wanted him to sober his ass up to meet my mother. What a bloody great impression this was going to make with her. I stood there with my hands in my face, then I tried to pull him up to stand on his feet. He was thinking this was a great joke, but I said, no, it's her and they're all here. Get your ass up, please, it's not funny. Tony was stumbling to his feet and I heard the keys turning in the front door. Suddenly it opened, just as we were both laughing trying to get him up. Of course the first person through the door happened to be Mum. Great, holy shit, this was all I could think to myself. The stench of alcohol was strong in the lounge. Mum stood there sternly looking at Tony and giving me that stare that mothers give their kids when they're not happy with them. Tony smiled with his cheeky grin and got to his feet, noticing that I was standing there frozen watching my mum. Hi, Mrs., he started to say politely, but before he could finish his sentence, Mum said, is this how you greet me for the first time? Where are your manners? She thought Tony would follow the Fijian custom of greeting someone with a kiss on the cheek or a hug, but he was in no fit state. Mum asked if he was hungry or wanted something to eat. Tony politely said, no thank you, and that he was feeling tired, but I knew he was a bit embarrassed as my sisters were there as well. I showed him to his room and he slept it off that evening. The days following his arrival in New Zealand didn't go as planned. Many of his extended family had caught wind of his secret rendezvous with me before he ventured off to Sydney. That started a whole saga, with many in the family giving my mum unnecessary stress and unleashing a flurry of hurt because he was staying with us and not them. Tony was as shocked as I was at how the relationship between us was turning out with them. Despite it all, we continued seeing each other, and that was all that mattered over the many years to come. Even back then, I was keeping my focus on Tony. Golden nuggets. Don't let anything get in the way of love. If it feels right, follow your heart.